Good evening, America. Tonight, I'm going to tell you something that will stop you cold. After nearly 3 months of war, after hundreds of airstrikes, after thousands of lives lost in Lebanon, Iran, and across the Middle East, after a global energy crisis that has driven up your gas prices, your grocery bills, and the cost of everything you buy, after ceasefire announcements and diplomatic summits and mediators flying between capitals around the clock, after all of that, here is where we stand tonight on May 27th, 2026. The United States and Iran are separated by a disagreement over the wording of a single sentence, maybe 2 sentences. That is what Secretary of State Marco Rubio told reporters. Disagreements over a word, a sentence, 1 word, 1 sentence, between peace and the continuation of a war that has already reshaped the entire Middle East. And while diplomats in Doha are arguing over that word, American bombs are still falling on Iranian soil. Tonight, we are going to break down exactly what that word might be, why it matters so enormously, and what is happening on every front of this crisis right now as the world waits for a deal that keeps refusing to arrive. Let us start with the single most important thing Rubio said yesterday, because it deserves far more attention than it has received. Speaking to reporters during his trip through India, Secretary of State Marco Rubio described the current state of U.S.-Iran negotiations with striking precision. He said the 2 sides had a pretty solid thing on the table. He said the framework was real and significant. And then he said this: there are disagreements over a word, a sentence. That is where this entire war now stands. Not over nuclear weapons, not over the Strait of Hormuz, not over whether Iran will open the waterway or whether America will lift the blockade. A word, a sentence. The gap between war and peace at this moment in history is the size of a single line of text in a memorandum that has not yet been signed. Now let us think about what that word or sentence might actually be, because the reporting from multiple credible sources gives us a very clear picture of the sticking points. And they are not small. Even if they sound small in Rubio's framing, each word and each sentence in this memorandum carries enormous consequences for what comes after it is signed. The first major sticking point is Iran's frozen assets. According to the IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency, the United States is still blocking the release of some of Iran's frozen funds that Tehran has demanded as part of the initial agreement. Iran has made clear, repeatedly and publicly, that sanctions relief and the unfreezing of assets are non-negotiable conditions for signing anything. The U.S. side has said that any financial relief will be tied directly and proportionately to Iran's actual delivery of results on the ground. No dust, no dollars. That is the phrase U.S. officials have been using internally. Iran's frozen assets will not be touched until Iran demonstrably opens the strait. Iran says that is unacceptable. Iran insists that at least partial asset release must happen simultaneously with the opening, not after it is verified. That disagreement over timing and sequencing may literally be the word or sentence Rubio is referring to. The second sticking point is Lebanon. The proposed memorandum reportedly includes a Lebanon ceasefire framework. But here is where it gets complicated in a way that most coverage is not fully explaining. Israel is pushing for language inside this memorandum that would explicitly allow it to carry out military operations in Lebanon in response to any threat. Israel wants a legal carve-out that lets it keep striking Hezbollah targets even after the broader ceasefire is in place. Iran is flatly rejecting that language. Tehran says it will not sign a document that gives Israel permission to continue bombing Lebanon. Iran says the Lebanon ceasefire must be sustainable and lasting, with no exceptions and no carve-outs. That is not a minor disagreement. That is a fundamental divide between what Israel considers necessary for its security and what Iran considers a minimum requirement for any deal. And the United States is caught directly in the middle, trying to satisfy both simultaneously when their demands are mutually exclusive. The third sticking point is the one that matters most for the long term, and it is the one that is genuinely dangerous. It is the question of whether Iran's nuclear enrichment will be mentioned in the memorandum at all, and if so, how? The U.S. wants some reference to Iran's nuclear program in the initial document, even if the details are left for the 60-day follow-on talks. Iran says nuclear issues are not part of the current negotiations at all. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said this publicly and clearly on Monday. And then a senior U.S. official said just as publicly that Iran had agreed in principle to dispose of its enriched uranium. Those 2 statements cannot both be true, but they are both on the record. And the gap between them is precisely what is preventing a deal from being signed. It is the word or sentence that Rubio is describing. It is the line in the document that says something about Iran's nuclear future that one side will accept and the other will not. Now, let us talk about something that happened yesterday that should be front-page news across the United States, but is being underreported. It tells you everything about the real state of this conflict and the real intentions of one of the key parties to it. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei, the man who succeeded his father after the elder Khamenei was killed in the February 28th strikes, issued a statement on Tuesday that was timed to coincide with the Hajj pilgrimage season. The timing was deliberate. Hajj is one of the most globally watched Islamic religious events of the year, and Khamenei used it as a platform to send a message to every Muslim-majority nation on earth. He wrote, and I want you to hear these words carefully, the nations and lands of the region will no longer serve as shields for American bases. America will no longer have a safe haven for mischief and the establishment of military bases in the region. Iran's supreme leader, while his own diplomats are sitting in Qatar trying to negotiate a peace memorandum with the United States, is publicly declaring that American military bases across the Middle East are no longer safe. He is signaling to every country in the region that hosts American troops, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, that their decision to shelter the U.S. military will come with consequences. He is calling out what he describes as the shaky Zionist regime as drawing near to the final stages of their cursed demise. And he praised Hezbollah fighters for achieving remarkable victories against the two fully armed terrorist American Zionist militaries. This is the supreme leader of the country America is trying to sign a peace deal with. This is the man whose endorsement of the deal's broad template U.S. officials say they understand has been given. And while giving that private endorsement, he is publicly threatening American military installations across the entire region and predicting Israel's destruction within 15 years. This is what America is negotiating with. This is the full picture, and every American deserves to understand it. At the same time that Khamenei was issuing these threats, senior Iranian officials who had just returned home from intense talks in Doha were being debriefed on their negotiations. The talks were described by Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency as generally positive. That is a careful, measured phrase. Generally positive, not conclusive. Not agreement reached, generally positive. Which in diplomatic language means we talked, we made some progress, and we are not there yet. And while those talks were called generally positive, something else was happening simultaneously at the Strait of Hormuz that tells you a great deal about the current state of play on the ground. The IRGC announced on Tuesday that 25 vessels, including oil tankers, had passed through the Strait of Hormuz in the last 24 hours after receiving permission and security coordination from Iran's Navy. 25 ships in 24 hours. Before this war, the normal daily traffic through the Strait of Hormuz was between 15 and 20 large vessels per day moving in each direction. So 25 ships permitted through in a day represents a partial opening, a demonstration of Iranian flexibility, a signal being sent to the world that Iran can turn the tap on when it chooses to. But it is not a full reopening. It is not freedom of navigation. It is Iran's Navy deciding which ships can pass and when, charging what it calls coordination fees and maintaining effective control over one of the most important waterways on the planet. That is exactly what Iran's billboard in Tehran's Vanak Square has been saying all along, forever in Iran's hand. Meanwhile, at the same time diplomacy was inching forward in Doha and Khamenei was issuing threats from Tehran, the Israeli Defense Forces were conducting one of their most intensive nights of airstrikes in Lebanon in weeks. The IDF struck more than 100 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon overnight. More than 100 targets in a single night. This is happening while a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah has technically been in place since April 16th. Israel has been conducting what it calls defensive and responsive operations throughout this ceasefire period, and Hezbollah has continued to fire rockets and missiles at northern Israel in response, or sometimes preemptively. The Lebanon ceasefire exists on paper. On the ground, it is a war that never stopped. And now we come to something that happened yesterday in the Strait of Hormuz that received almost no attention in American media, but which should alarm every person watching this video. A tanker reported an external explosion off Oman's coast. A commercial vessel, attempting to transit the waters adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz, was struck by what appears to have been an external explosive device. Shipping data showed that at least 2 liquefied natural gas tankers were exiting the Strait of Hormuz on Monday, heading to Pakistan and China, while a supertanker carrying Iraqi crude oil for China had finally left the Gulf after being stranded for nearly 3 months. These movements are signs of limited reopening. But the tanker explosion off Oman's coast is a sign of something else entirely. It is a reminder that the Strait of Hormuz is still a war zone, that mines are still present in the waterway, and that any ship attempting to transit it does so at real physical risk. The U.S. military said it was conducting operations to clear Iranian mines from the strait. That mine-clearing operation is itself an act of war conducted inside waters that Iran claims to control. And it is happening right now as diplomats argue over a word. Here is something else you need to know about the economic reality of this crisis that is landing directly on ordinary Americans. Major airlines have been warning their passengers to expect disruptions and higher fares. You may have seen stories about what happens to your flight if jet fuel costs spike. The answer is that costs rise, fares rise, and some routes become economically unviable. Companies are paying millions of dollars to reroute their cargo ships around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to delivery times and massive fuel costs to every shipment. Panama Canal operators have been reporting that companies are paying extraordinary premiums to jump the queue and use the canal rather than face the Hormuz route. Myanmar, one of the world's most vulnerable nations, cannot get fuel and fertilizer for its farmers because the ships carrying those supplies have been stuck in the Hormuz crisis for 3 months. The economic damage of this war is not limited to the Middle East. It is global. It is reaching your grocery store and your gas station and your airline ticket. And it will continue as long as the Strait of Hormuz remains under effective Iranian control. Now let us talk about where the deal process actually goes from here, because the next 72 hours remain genuinely critical. Here is the picture as clearly as the available reporting allows us to draw it. The Iranian delegation that traveled to Doha for intense talks has now returned home to Tehran. Senior Iranian officials are back in the country, presumably reporting to Supreme Leader Khamenei and the Supreme National Security Council on what was discussed and what remains unresolved. The process for any deal to be finalized requires approval from the Supreme National Security Council first and then final ratification from Khamenei himself. U.S. officials have said they believe that process will take at least several more days, and that even Khamenei's endorsement of the broad template does not mean he has approved the specific language. White House officials told reporters earlier this week that they did not expect a deal by Sunday, and that they believed the Iranian system simply does not move fast enough for an agreement to come that quickly. On the American side, Vice President J.D. Vance, Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner have all been involved in the negotiations alongside Rubio. That is an extraordinary concentration of senior American officials on a single diplomatic track. It tells you how seriously the Trump White House is treating this deal, and also how politically important a successful outcome is to the president. Trump launched this war. Trump needs to be the one who ends it. A signed memorandum, however imperfect, is a political win that Trump desperately wants to claim before domestic opposition in Congress, before more Republican senators cross the aisle on war powers votes, and before the economic pain of the Hormuz crisis does lasting damage to American consumers and to Trump's approval ratings. But Trump also knows that signing a bad deal would be catastrophic. Every hawk in the Republican Party, every former national security official who has watched this war unfold, every senator like Wicker and Graham who said this deal would be a disaster, they will all be watching every word of whatever is signed. Trump cannot afford to be seen as having gone to war with Iran, destroyed its military infrastructure, killed its supreme leader, imposed a naval blockade, and then walked away with a deal that leaves Iran's missile program intact, its proxy networks intact, and its hand firmly on the Strait of Hormuz. That is the trap this war has created. And there is no obvious way out of it that satisfies all of the competing demands simultaneously. The Iranian side faces its own equally impossible internal contradictions. The new supreme leader is navigating a country whose military has been devastated, whose economy is under dual blockade, whose cities have been struck hundreds of times, and whose people are desperate for the war to end. And yet the same system that produced the ceasefire framework is also the system that produced Khamenei's Tuesday statement threatening American military bases across the region. The hardliners inside Tehran, who are advising the new supreme leader, are arguing that any nuclear concession represents a fundamental surrender of Iran's sovereignty and deterrence. The pragmatists are arguing that without a deal, economic collapse is the only alternative. Both voices are in the same room. And the word or sentence that Rubio is describing as the final obstacle may be exactly the line where those two Iranian factions cannot agree with each other, let alone with the United States. And so we arrive at tonight, May 27th, 2026. 90 days since American and Israeli bombs began falling on Iran, the Strait of Hormuz is partially open and partially mined. Iran's supreme leader is threatening American military bases in the region. The IDF struck more than 100 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon last night. A tanker was hit by an explosion off the coast of Oman. Senior Iranian officials have returned from Doha with no deal. Rubio says disagreements over a word and a sentence are blocking everything. U.S. Central Command conducted fresh strikes inside Iran just yesterday. 25 ships transited the strait with Iranian permission. And the world is waiting for a piece of paper to be signed that may contain the most consequential language of this entire decade. The next deal announcement, if and when it comes, will not be the end of this story. It will be the beginning of 60 more days of nuclear negotiations that will be harder, more complex, and more dangerous than anything that has come before. Because the memorandum, if signed, will require Iran to actually do something with nearly 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium. It will require the IAEA to get inspectors back into a country that has been at war with the United States for 3 months. It will require the United States and Iran to agree on enrichment limits that both governments can sell to their own domestic audiences. And it will require Israel to accept a Lebanon ceasefire framework that it has already indicated it finds unacceptable. This is not almost over. This is entering a new and even more dangerous phase. And you need to be watching every single day. America, here's my question for you tonight. Secretary Rubio says the deal is being blocked by a word or a sentence. Iran's supreme leader is simultaneously threatening American military bases across the region, while his diplomats are negotiating a peace deal. American bombs are still falling on Iranian soil during a ceasefire. And the deal on the table, even if signed, will leave Iran's missiles untouched, its proxies unfunded but unrestrained, and its hand on the Strait of Hormuz for the foreseeable future. Here's what I want to know from you directly. Is there any version of this deal that you would personally consider a real American victory? Or do you believe this war has created a situation where there is no outcome left that actually serves American interests? Drop your answer in the comments right now. This conversation is bigger than any headline. It is about what America is, what America does, and what America is willing to accept in your name. Subscribe and turn on notifications. This story moves every single hour, and we will be here every single day telling you the truth.